Hello, folks, and welcome to today's webinar. We're letting attendees into the room and we'll get started in just a few short moments. All righty. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and whatever part of the world you call home. My name is Bradley Davis, and I'm the Strategic Business Development Manager here at IACET, joined by Aaron Goosh, IACET's Communications and Marketing Coordinator. And together, we're thrilled to welcome you to today's product placement webinar, From Surviving to Thriving, Creating Scalable Remote Learning Solutions, presented by our partners at Harbinger Interactive Learning. A few housekeeping notes before we kick off today. We want to encourage you all to actively engage with our presenters and your fellow participants using both the chat box and QA modules, both of which are located at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen. We'll also be answering your questions live at the end of today's presentation, so don't be afraid to drop any questions or comments into that module at any point during today's discussion. Finally, please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand on the IACET website following today's presentation. With all of that out of the way, let's get started, folks. We are thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Rahul Singh, the Senior Director of Business Development at Harbinger Interactive Learning. Rahul is a digital learning enthusiast and is passionate about helping organizations and leaders solve challenges around learner engagement and student outcomes through intervention of learning technologies. In a career span of over 15 years in the digital learning space, Rahul has helped a host of global organizations and educational institutions in implementing a myriad of new initiatives around their digital learning strategy. We're thrilled to welcome him on today's webinar and join our audience in excitement at seeing what he plans to share. Rahul, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brad, for the introduction. And thank you to the IACET community for having us here today. We are very excited to have this conversation with the IACET community on this important topic of creating scalable remote learning solutions. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon wherever you are in the world today. Thank you for taking the time out for joining us for this conversation. We really would like to make this an interactive conversation. So at any point of time, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We'll take turns to answer your question. And of course, at the end of this discussion, we do have a Q&A session, but don't hold on to your questions for the Q&A session. Please feel free to jump in, share your thoughts, share your success stories, anything that you have done around remote learning, which has been successful, which could be useful for the community. So with that, without taking further time, we'll start with the discussion for today. So let me briefly talk about Harbinger Interactive Learning, who we are, what we do. So primarily, we are an organization which has been in the business for the last 3 decades, more than 3 decades. At a group level, we are 800 odd people with dual shore offices with presence in US and India. Primarily from an e-learning development perspective, we are 150 odd e-learning professionals. And the different type of skill set that includes is instructional designers, multimedia producers, visual designers, programmers, project managers. And we work with a variety of industries cutting across domains, so including life sciences, e-learning catalog companies, which are primarily into health and safety and soft skills, higher education, manufacturing, heavy engineering. So that's briefly about Harbinger Interactive Learning. Okay. Now, we'll start with a discussion in terms of what is the business need behind this talk about creating scalable remote learning solutions. I mean, we had been doing instructor-led training, we had been doing e-learning, we had been doing blended learning. But what has changed? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. One, the most important thing throughout the world, this evolving COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented humanitarian, economic, and psychological demands on our society and businesses. One of the important business needs for organizations during this time is to create a sustainable and scalable learning ecosystem for the ever-evolving workplace. Now, we all know that, how many organizations have decided that, they might not go fully physical. I mean, literally, I would say a huge majority of organizations are going to have a blended or a hybrid working environment. That is where the importance of remote learning solutions becomes much more important, because the workplace is evolving. So that's the business need. Now, moving ahead, the change catalyst. Who is going to be the change catalyst? The evolving role of L&D leaders. The L&D leaders, we as L&D leaders are the change catalysts. It is not just the workplace which is evolving, but at the same time, the role of L&D leaders is also evolving pretty fast. No longer the L&D can afford to work in silos. We as L&D leaders are the catalyst for this change. And one of the key jobs that we have on our hands is to keep our remote workforce engaged by bringing learning in the flow of their remote work. There are no water cooler moments. There are no peer-to-peer discussions. You turn around and you ask a question to your colleague and get the issue resolved then and there. You're working remotely. How do you keep your learners engaged while they are working remotely and keep them productive and keep them motivated? So we understood the business need, and we agree upon the fact that the L&D leaders are the change catalysts. So what does it mean for a chief learning officer? What are the evolving CLO mandates that we have? Well, there are 4 key highlights of CLO mandates, and we'll talk about them one by one. Business continuity. I think almost a couple of years back, 18, 19 months back, when the world suddenly went into lockdown, one of the key challenges was that businesses were not prepared. Probably all of the businesses were not prepared for continuity. So, but we learned that. So now, once we have learned this, we have to continue to leverage this knowledge as to how do we ensure business continuity. Today it was a pandemic, tomorrow it could be something else. What is the second mandate? Remote work. I think we discussed that remote work is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. So a lot of our employees will opt for remote work. A lot of our target audience customers would opt for remote work. So how do we create the best possible learning solutions for them? Driving change. That's one of the most important things. There has to be a very effective and a robust change management process. And the last one is culture. While all this is happening, an organization cannot afford to lose its culture that they have built over a period of time. So just to summarize, these are the 4 key CLO mandates: business continuity, remote work, driving change, and maintaining the culture of the organization while all this is happening. And in the next slides, we'll look at some possible ways through which we can do this. In fact, we'll talk about a few specific cases. And also, we will also, seek the audience opinion. So we'll have some polls coming up on our screens now. In fact, this is the first one. And this is where we want your opinion on the business continuity aspect. So I would request Brad to run the polls for the audience. You should have it on your screen now. You can select multiple options. And the options that we have are, the first one is helping the organization take training virtual, enabling sales teams to successfully sell remotely, building an environment of trust among employees, awareness of health, safety, and compliance. And if there's something other which comes in your mind, please add in the chat box. All right, so we see a good percentage of our audiences responding. We'll keep this poll open for some more time. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who participated in this poll. We have the options in front of us, answers in front of us, rather, I would say. So the clear winner is helping the organization take training virtual, 58% people who voted today have rated this as the first preference. And the second option, which is at 29%, is building an environment of trust among employees. I would totally agree to this. That's one of the important things, followed by 8% for health, safety, and compliance, and 4% for enabling sales teams. Okay, so helping the organization take training virtual. That's the unanimous choice from the audience. All right, thank you very much for participating in this poll. We'll move ahead and we'll talk about a particular case, a sample use case, in terms of how we helped at Harbinger, how we helped an organization training virtually, and not just take training virtually for the sake of it, but create a business impact or ensure business continuity. So this case study that we are going to talk about this was primarily for a Fortune 500 financial services organization operating out of US. And their main driver of the business was their sales reps having face-to-face meetings or conversations with their prospects and selling finance products, insurance products, and all those things. But suddenly when the pandemic hit, all this face-to-face meetings stopped, and not all of them were prepared to sell virtually or sell remotely. So what did we do? And this organization has a global workforce of around 50,000 odd employees spread across the globe. So what was the solution that was devised? So we created talking head videos, presenter videos, short videos, which educated the sales force as to how to sell remotely, how to conduct your meetings in an online environment, in a virtual environment through a Zoom with your prospective clients and continue the business, maintain the business continuity. So, and this was done in a record period of time, in a couple of weeks' time, which in turn was rolled out to sales reps across the globe to empower them sell remotely. And through this, it was ensured that the business continuity remains there. We'll move on to the next poll now. And this poll primarily is about remote work. And it's on your screen now. So the question is, what challenges has remote work introduced in your organization? And when we say organization, for anyone in the audience who represent a training provider company or a e-learning catalog company, you can talk on behalf of your customers that what challenges has remote work introduced in your customer organizations. And this poll, thank you, Aaron, this poll lets you select multiple options: disengaged employees, productivity loss, communication gaps, difficulty in onboarding, especially during this great resignation wave. And if there's anything else, please type it in the chat. And if it's none, things are going pretty well, please select that. So we see quite a few responses coming in. Thank you very much for the active participation again. All right, so we should be looking at the results pretty soon. Right, yeah. So the number one point over here is communication gaps. I would agree to this. I mean, every day, in every department of our organization, we experience this, and I'm sure, as the audience has suggested, this is being experienced across multiple organizations. And the second one is difficulty in onboarding, disengaged employees, followed by productivity loss. And there's 10% people who have 10% audience who have voted. They have said none, things are going pretty well, and that's really wonderful to know. We have a reason in the chat box, and I'll just pull that out for us. Building and sustaining a high trust organization. Absolutely. That's one of the important aspects. When you're not meeting face to face, when you're not having those conversations, when you're not able to gauge the body language of the individual with whom you are talking to. It's pretty difficult. It can become pretty difficult to maintain the trust in the organization. Yes, absolutely. And, in addition to that, one of our audiences has said, understanding generational differences is so important. We need to talk about different values. Absolutely. That's a great point that you have brought up. So now moving ahead in terms of the remote work, let me talk about a sample use case. And this use case is particularly for disengaged employees. And that was, I think, number 2 in the audience poll that came up. So what did we do in this case? So basically, this talks about how to keep call center representatives engaged. I mean, in a typical environment, when every pre-pandemic days, a call center environment is one of those places which is always buzzing with energy, positivity. There's a lot of vibrancy, a lot of conversations happening and all those things. But suddenly you have to maintain the business continuity. So you cannot shut down the call center operations, but then everyone is working remotely from their homes. So how do you keep these folks engaged? So this example is for a leading internet service provider in the US, and they had to quickly move their call center operations from home offices. For some of these call center representatives, this was not easy as they were going through this change for the first time. They had never done this. So they were just totally new to this entire thing. Suddenly the support system that they had in their offices while handling customers had gone away, or at least it was not quickly available. So, those peer-to-peer conversations and those water cooler moments and those kind of things. So they had to wait, they had to rely, they were not sure, the confidence level started dropping. So what do we do in that situation? So we bring in technology into play, and the solution that was used was an artificial intelligence enabled virtual coach was deployed, and the representatives could have a conversation with this virtual coach and clarify their doubts. And at the back end, it was working on machine learning and natural language processing. And it was synthesizing a lot of data and getting smarter day by day because, there was a lot of commonality in the questions that were being raised by representatives. So every day, by answering those kind of questions using the ML and natural language processing algorithms, the chatbot was becoming intelligent. And the advantage for the call center representatives was there was someone whom they could reach out to immediately without waiting. So that brought their confidence back. So now we're coming to the third mandate for a CLO, driving change. And I'm sure all of us have gone through this. So driving change, but we are particularly talking about bringing in behavioral changes. In the post-pandemic world, would many of your learning interventions aim to drive behavioral changes? It's a yes, no, not sure kind of response. So please feel free to go ahead and submit your responses. Right, that's a good point in the chat box. Either drive or sustain a particular change. That's important. Not necessarily every time it's about driving a change. It's also about sustaining a change which had taken place. Thank you. Right, so we should be seeing the poll results on our screens anytime now. Okay, sorry. So 62% of the audience who have voted, they have said yes. Many of our learning interventions aim to drive behavioral changes. 14% people have said no, and 24% people have said not sure. Perfect. Thank you very much for participating in this poll. We'll look at a use case now. So moving ahead in our conversation. So this is a sample use case. And this was primarily about how to drive safe practices for frontline workers. Now, a lot of us, people like me, who can afford to do their job with an internet connection and a laptop, and they don't need to wander out of their homes, we were pretty safe, and the risk was relatively low on the lower side. But a lot of our friends, families, acquaintances, they were out there. These were the frontline workers, the healthcare staff, and the public safety people, and all those, the first responders, emergency responders, all they were out there. Now, it was not normal for them. The way they would operate in normal circumstances, things had changed, which primarily meant, of course, we had to train these frontline workers that how to bring in certain behavioral changes. And what we did was we implemented the nudge learning theory to bring in those behavioral practices. Nudge is a very important concept. This has been used in the socio-economic environment across countries for socio-economic reforms across countries. One of the countries had used nudge learning to motivate their citizens to pay taxes on time, bringing in a behavioral change. In the learning context, this became very popular after the year 2017, when Richard Thaler won a Nobel Prize on nudge learning. And Google implemented it. Well, there's one very short story I'll share over here. When Google did a survey across their organization, one of the key things that came out was the mid-level managers had an intimidating behavior. And this was a shocker for Google. So they needed to change this behavior. So what they did was they created micro-learning courses. They call it whisper courses. And probably at one particular time of a day in a week, week after week, they send out these short learning nuggets via email, like in a spaced repetitive manner, the spaced learning manner. And after a certain period of time, the survey was done again, and there was a positive improvement. The survey which said that, the earlier survey which said that the behavior was intimidating, that ratio had decreased. So there was a positive increment in the behavior. And there are certain other successful case studies on nudge learning. Right, so this is a last poll in the discussion, and this one is about culture. Which one of these would take a hit if you're not able to sustain your organizational culture through a remote workforce? Brand value, customer relations, mutual trust among employees, all of the above. Brand is such an integral part of any organization. Right, so we are seeing some great responses coming in, and we should have the answers on our screen now. Right, so 70% of people who have voted, they have said all of the above: brand value, customer relations, mutual trust among employees. Thank you very much. So we'll look at the last use case for today. And that use case is, okay, this is my favorite one: improving drive-through customer experience. So this is we did for a multi-unit retail chain based out of West Coast in US, and they're pretty popular for their hamburgers. And interestingly, this particular organization, the founder of this organization, of this multi-unit retail chain, was the inventor of the drive-through concept. When I got to know this, I always thought that, it would have been someone like a McDonald's or a KFC who might have, or a Taco Bell's who might have invented the drive-through counter, experience. But these folks had invented it. But the irony was, the sales at the drive-through counter were reducing, and the customer experience was also reducing. So neither the customer was happy, nor the dollars were coming in. And when a deeper analysis was done, it was found out that, there's a lot of churn of employees that was happening because it was gig economy, peak seasons, you hire people during peak seasons and holiday seasons, then you have to let go of people, then you have new people. People join a multi-unit retail chain for short gigs and a pit stop in their career and things like that. So it was decided that there would be a scalable e-learning solution or a remote learning solution will be created, and we created a game-based learning solution for them, which actually had scenarios. So they would, within that e-learning solution, the learners would actually interact with a customer, and they would respond to the customer, and based on their responses they would get points, move ahead in the game. And it was very fun, very vibrant for the millennials and Gen Zs of kind of target audience. And after 6 months, this was rolled out to 330 outlets across the country. And after 6 months, when a survey was again done, it was realized that the sales percentage went up by 5%, and the customer experience rating went up by 1% point. And I've been told that 5% is a pretty good number in the multi-unit retail chain industry. So this is where a game-based learning was implemented to sustain culture. And this was about not driving a change, coming back to a point from our audience, this was about sustaining culture. So these were the 4 mandates for the CLO, and supported by 4 use cases. Before we move on to the next slide, we'll just take a question which is there in the chat box. The question is, what is the definition of nudge learning? So definitely we'll send you some detailed information on nudge learning, but in simpler terms, nudge is like what our parents, our teachers have been doing to us. For example, nudging your kid to get up on time or get ready for school on time or complete his or her homework on time. And you couple it with, so there are multiple theories that come together to create this cocktail of nudge learning. It's a principle of least coercion. So you cannot force the learners to do some things. You have to allow them the freedom to do things on their own. Then Eisenhower's 2x2 matrix. Not everything is important and urgent. And the spaced repetition. It's actually a mathematical formula, the spaced repetition thing. It says that if you want to reinforce learning in someone, if you send training nuggets or short bursts of learning for that learning objectives in a spaced repetitive manner. So for example, every Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, I send this short learning nugget to the target audience. And if you do that in following that formula of spaced learning, then you will be able to bring in that behavioral change. So all these 3 principles come together and create the concept of nudge learning. Literally nudging the learner to do those things, not forcing them to do anything. And I can go on and on this nudge part of it. It's very interesting, and we can definitely have a separate conversation on that sometime. Right, I'll just do a pulse check with the audience. How are we doing on the engagement part? Because we have been talking about engagement. If you're feeling bored, if you're feeling, oh, it's too theoretical, please give me a thumbs down. I'll try to change things here. I'll try to do something differently. If you're finding it okay, just give me a thumbs up, or just say it's okay, fine. I'll continue at that speed. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you, everyone. So we'll move ahead in our discussion. Now we'll come to so till now we mostly spoke about why and what. Now in this last section, we'll purely concentrate on the how of things. So to begin with, you can say that, okay, what's the big deal in creating a remote learning solution? You get an LMS, you use Articulate Storyline 360, you create some e-learning materials and, put them on the e-learning and roll it out to the users. Or you integrate Zoom with your LMS and you have a facilitator sitting in, Chicago and delivering lectures for your audience across the globe. Yes, that was the model which everyone adopted when the pandemic hit because we were not prepared. So we scrambled, and whatever we could get our hands on, we just tried it. In my opinion, that was most of it. For most of us, it was band-aid option. But then as we kept on evolving and as we kept on learning things and we kept on hearing from the customers and the learners primarily and the students in terms of what they want, we came up with this framework. It's very interesting. It's this has got a four component framework. We call it the PESC model. And primarily what it means is prepare, engage, support, and evaluate. And we'll talk briefly about these 4 blocks. Prepare is before your learner and facilitator, and I keep saying this remote learning, but I truly wanted to be honest that, there should be coined something as remote learning and remote instruction solutions, because it was equally tough for the instructors and facilitators. Yes, it was tough for learners and students, but trust me, I mean, anyone in this audience, in this room who had been doing this, who has been, facilitating or delivering instructor-led training programs, I'm sure you would have experienced this. So, so coming back to the prepare part, so prepare is before you get into a blended learning program, or before you start delivering a session on Zoom, or before your student or your learner gets on the LMS to start consuming self-paced learning. So how do you prepare the learner? The pre-work, the prerequisite. Then you have engage. Now, for example, when I'm doing this webinar, at the back of the mind, consciously, I have this concern that am I able to keep my audience engaged? Will my audience start dropping off of this webinar midway through? So that's a very important aspect of it. And as educators, as facilitators, as training leaders, we always have this, that, we have to create an impact through our training, through our learning solutions. We are not here to check boxes. So how do you keep your learners engaged in the remote learning environment? Continuous support. Once you have delivered this session on Zoom, or you have provided an e-learning course to the learner, do you leave them alone? Do you leave them on their own? No, you have to provide them continuous support. Just prior to the pandemic hit, there was a lot of buzz around learning in the flow of work. Josh Bersin coined this term, and he was pretty vocal about it. I would say that, after the pandemic, it became learning in the flow of remote work. And it was much more important because the support system, the office, the physical environment, the colleagues, the peers, supervisors, they were not there. And the last one is evaluate. So it's great. You can put together a framework and you can say that, this will do miracles and it will bring in business impact and great results. But do you have a mechanism to evaluate it and close the loop? Evaluate and then implement the shortcomings again and keep the cycle going on. So that's the framework: prepare, engage, support, evaluate. I think there are a few comments on the framework in the chat box. We'll take a look at some of these. So one of the comments is, I'm not familiar with this framework and I'm not sure if it is an apples to apples comparison. We have been using a modified version of ADDIE in design and implementation of remote learning. Yes, absolutely. See, there's no such hard-coded formula. This model, PESC, this model was devised by Harbinger based on the requirements that we were seeing from our customers, based on what challenges they were facing. And it's perfectly fine that, if you feel that, for your organization or for your customers, a different model would work. So taking ADDIE, modifying it, that's a classic example. And we'll peel the layers further on this PESC model. You'll find out that, there's a lot of commonality. It's not something that, has been not something that we have reinvented the wheel. But yeah, we have restructured the blocks as to how it should happen. Yeah, there's one comment that I write notes before my meeting on what our subjects would be about. Yes, thank you very much for that comment. And that's where we want to bring in a support system for our facilitators, for our instructors. There's so much of time that they spend in preparing for their sessions. One of the reports I was reading from McKinsey, it said that, I don't recall the exact numbers, but the intent of that report or survey was that educators and facilitators should be spending more time with students and learners. Instead, what the pandemic has done, or what this entire remote thing has done, that they're spending time pre and post the sessions. They're spending more time pre and post. So preparing and the after session administrative works, there more time is going in there. Thank you for those comments. They're encouraging. Please keep them coming. If anyone has used anything differently that has worked successfully in terms of remote learning, please feel free to go ahead and share your thoughts, or share your story there. It would be useful for the community. Okay, so this one's going to be a slightly busy slide. Sorry for that. We just try to put in a lot of information here. I hope the text is readable. And I'll just try to make sense over here. So probably the first section that I would request you to look at it is, please look at the pre-event, event, and the post-event section. So event is where the facilitator is delivering the session in a virtual environment, or the learner is taking the course on an LMS. That's the event. That's the learning event. And then you have the pre-event, and then you have the post-event activities. So the prepare part, now we'll have to tie the blocks or connect the dots with the PESC model. The prepare part is the pre-event. So some of the activities that we have written: promote, publish class information, manage registration, set up virtual meeting room, get learners ready, send motivation nudges, train the trainer. Now, if you notice, a lot of these things are administrative tasks and time consuming from a facilitator perspective. And from a learner perspective, we want to keep them engaged and keep them curious as to what they're going to experience in the event. So that's where we are saying, sending motivation nudges, or, just sending teaser videos that, okay, which talks about what the event would be about, or what they're going to learn, or what are the learning objectives. And most of these administrative activities can be automated through technology. That will free up time for educators. I'll just give you a quick example. So someone said here that, I create notes for my session. So what if there was a tool, an artificial intelligence enabled tool, through which you could push a lot of text, pages of text, and that could summarize the content for you, summarize the text for you. So you would have a summarized abstract of what you could use in your actual session. And then the event part is, of course, whether it's an e-learning thing or it's happening in virtual. Let's say for a moment, if it's virtual. So there's, probably someone looking at a PowerPoint. The way I'm doing this is pretty boring stuff. I'm looking at a PowerPoint and I'm talking, and then there are a few chat responses coming in and all those things coming in. But what if we had some interactive assessments in between, some game-based activities? We created breakout rooms within the Zoom, and we created, short groups and gave them activities to complete. So making the environment lively, making the audience, engage with each other. And then the post-event. So now you have these Zoom recordings or these webinar recordings. And so it's pretty boring. I mean, if you ask someone that, you need to go through this 60 minutes webinar recording for reinforcement of learning, it's a task. So what could be done? Probably, what if you were able to add layers of interactivity over the existing video, through which they could go to a specific section of a video and listen to it, or create micro learning nuggets out of the video and push them as nudges for reinforcement. Generate voice to text transcripts. So what if this process could be automated? There are features, some of these virtual web meeting rooms have started giving this feature, but it's not error proof. What if there was an error proof application that could help you with it? So the pre-event, event, post-event. So the pre-event is, just to summarize, connecting it with the PESC model. Pre-event is prepare. During the event is engage. Post-event is support and evaluate. So that's how the PESC model works out. There is a couple of more comments coming in, a couple of comments and maybe one question, and we'll take a look at those. So one of our audience has said that, I also prepare my presentations with video on my special guest. That's definitely an interesting concept. I mean, that breaks the monotony and brings the involvement in there. Thank you for sharing that. Now there's one question over here. Do you find that people get frustrated when more and more things become automated? There could be a yes and no answer to this. I'll share my thoughts and I'll invite thoughts from others. Some of the mundane tasks. I was talking to some of the educators lately, and they said that, one of the things that we hate doing is when we deliver a session on a Zoom link, what we have to do is we have to take screenshots of the attendees, and then later we have to use those screenshots to mark the attendance in another system. I mean, for me as an individual, I would really not want to do it if that can be automated. So when I say, in my opinion, when I say getting automated, it's the mundane tasks, the administrative tasks, which the technology and the system can take care of, so that the educators and facilitators can be involved more on the student outcomes kind of thing. Yeah, just to add to that, you added, just in continuation to that question, maybe if they're not as inept with tech or familiar with tech, I agree, that can be frustrating. And that's where in our model, the PESC model, we are saying that that prepare part, it's one of the key aspects is preparing the facilitators and educators to get adopted to technology, or the other way is knowing your facilitators and educators and then implementing technology based on that. So not imposing the technology on them. But very valid point. I really like this point. I agree. I mean, sometimes we all feel that we are living in the digital world, but trust me, just prior to this meeting, I was struggling putting my slides together in a slideshow, and I've been doing this for the last 10 years, trust me. But my colleagues here can vouch for that. So you never know, it can become tricky, and they need support. So of course, that's definitely a situation. And actually that brings us to this particular topic, which is tech infrastructure to implement PESC model. So, and this is just a suggestive model. Not necessarily all these components would be required. And we are just suggesting a few things over here, which can create the environment. So one is this academy, it's Harbinger Academy. It's a Moodle-based learning management system, which can be customized and white labeled as per your organization and can be set up in a quick period of time, probably in a matter of weeks time rather than months. And it's not a very heavy investment. And Moodle, as you know, is an open source technology. Sprinkle Zone. This is our micro learning delivery platform. This is designed to uh, push nudge notifications, nudge learning, and this sprinkle zone can be integrated with the Harbinger Academy LMS. And offline player. So there has been a lot of talk during this remote learning scenarios. A talk started about internet neutrality. Not even in the most advanced of the countries, it's not there, the internet neutrality. So people who have better access to internet, would they have better outcomes? Would they do financially, relatively be financially more well off in their lives? So that's something that started coming in. So that's where offline player can come into picture. It's basically an application which can be integrated with any learning management system, and that allows students and learners to consume e-learning content while they're offline. You just have to have internet at 2 points of interaction. First is when you're accessing the course for the first time, you download it in a safe and secure encrypted manner on your local machine. You consume the content, and then when you're done, you sync that content or that package with the LMS, and it updates your training records, your learning progress, your assessment scores, all those things. And then there's a bunch of custom applications that can be developed. So integration of something like a Microsoft Teams or a Zoom with a learning management system. If you have existing applications that you're using, that can be integrated. So basically putting together a robust and a scalable tech environment, which, when I say robust and scalable, but at the same time, it's economically viable, and it does not take months because, for sure, some of us who would have been a part of an LMS implementation process, how long it can take to actually implement or migrate from one LMS to the other. So we try to keep it simple and fast as much as possible. Right, so this is my last slide before we open up for the Q&A session. And this is primarily the summary of what we spoke about today. So we spoke about the 4 evolving Chief Learning Officer mandates. First one is business continuity. Second is remote work, changing behaviors, and sustaining culture. Workplaces are getting transformed all around us, that we agreed upon. Learning leaders, we as L&D leaders have a big part to play. And together, we can help people make the most of this change. So this was all from my side, and now we'll open up for discussion. Please go ahead, share your ideas, thoughts, experiences, questions, anything that you agree, disagree with, please.
Well, that was great, Raul. Thank you. As Bradley mentioned earlier, my name is Aaron Gooch, and I'm the Communications and Marketing Coordinator here at IACET. We'll be moving over to the question and answer portion of today's webinar. So please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A module located at the bottom middle section of your Zoom screen, or post those in the chat and we'll be sure to address them. We already have a few questions coming in, so let's get started. I'll ask the first one here. What could be some potential ways to keep the learners engaged while we provide them with more of self-paced e-learning in virtual sessions?
Right, so thank you, Aaron, for that question. So probably I'll share one example each. So if you're in a virtual environment, a facilitator is delivering a session via Zoom and all. So there could be, you could use tools through which you can create game-based learning assessments or quick activities, and you can give it to the learner. So like the polls that we did, what if those polls were not part of the Zoom, but they were kind of an interactive assessment, which the learners or the audience in the webinar today could access on their devices and answer them. And it could show some leaderboard kind of thing and all those things. So bringing in engagement for the learner. And yes, in an asynchronous environment, when people are consuming e-learning material and when there is no facilitator or peer learners over there, I would say artificial intelligence enabled virtual coach that can come into a picture. And please, when I say artificial intelligence enabled coach, it doesn't mean the simple chatbots that you have on your website, because they're pretty standard, right? They're like hard coded. They know they only have answers to specific questions for which they are trained for. There's an acronym in the chat box, and please pardon me, but if you could please write the full form of that. Sorry, I should have thought about it. I thought it's something complex in for me. Yes, I agree. What's in it for me? That's important for the learner. That's where we go back to the prepare part. When you're preparing your learners for this thing, for the event, that's where you can tell them. Actually, that brings us to a point wherein is micro credentials, badges. I mean, there's so much talk about skill gap, and everyone is talking about skilling, upskilling, reskilling. So if our courses, of course, IACET community members have continuing education units as credits and all those things. But if there could be this micro credentialing, digital badges, verified and supported by employers. So it's about connecting the dots, upskilling people and then helping them, secure jobs. So those kind of things.
All right, we'll move on to the next question here. How do you personalize the content as you become more and standardized with IA and other remote learning?
How do you personalize the content as you become more and more standardized with IA and other remote learning? I'll be honest, I do not have an answer to that question right now, but I'll think through it a bit and we will respond to you via email.
All right, we'll move on to the next question here. Oh, clicked out of it on accident. What is a typical process to convert a classroom-based training program into a self-paced e-learning program?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So, primarily, the way it starts is, so if you have a classroom training program, then for sure you'll have some training materials like, instructor PowerPoints or student guides or instructor workbooks. So and if it needs to be converted into e-learning, the process will start from requirement analysis, wherein our instructional designers would analyze the content. They'll try to understand what are the learning objectives, who's the target audience, and based on that, they'll put together the instructional design approach. Once that's reviewed and approved, we'll put together the storyboard. The storyboard is actually a blueprint of your e-learning course. It will contain information like what would the screen look like, what would be the text, the picture, the images, the voiceover, everything. And the storyboard goes through review and approval from stakeholders. And then the functional output is developed. And that functional output is tested for user LMS and user testing and all those things, and it's deployed. So it's a pretty collaborative process with checks and balances in place, and instructional design is at the core of it. And then you can have multiple variety of modalities. It could be, game-based learning or a scenario-based learning or a micro-learning or a, simulation-based learning, those kind of things.
All right, move on to the next one here. How do you measure your ROI of e-learning?
Right. That's a great question. And in fact, that is one question which has been continuously raised whenever we as L&D leaders go asking for budget approvals. I think this question comes back to us is that, what is the ROI? I'll be honest and I'll say that not every time it's possible to gauge the ROI of the learning, but you have to think early in the game. While you are designing the e-learning program, you have to think through this as to how would you plan to gauge the ROI. Now, specifically, I'll go back to that hot dog multi-unit retail chain, the drive-through counter example that we were looking at. So when we created the e-learning program, initially during the design phase, we mutually agreed with the organization that these are the data points that we'll have to capture. and they were not talking to each other. These systems were not talking to each other. So on the drive-through sales counters, the revenues were getting recorded. So we're getting an XLS of data for the revenue numbers. Then there was this app for the organization on which the customers would rate the service experience. So we were getting that customer rating experience from that application. And then the LMS was giving us data on course completion, assessment records, and all those things. And then we connected the dots that, okay, so out of those 330 retail outlets, we saw that retail outlets where the completion rate of the courses and the assessment scores of the learners were relatively higher, they secured higher revenue and higher customer ratings. So that were the data points that showed that, okay, this is the return on investment of this e-learning. This is just one example. For every other case, we have to work out the data points that we want to capture before we roll out the e-learning program. And then we have to connect the dots with those data points and figure out whether we have been able to make an impact or not.
Well, this has been a great role. We should really start to close it out here, but before I pass it back over to Bradley, do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aaron, for taking these questions. And thank you very much, everyone. I think it was really wonderful. I would like to thank the IACET community for having us here today. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Well, Rahul, that was a fantastic presentation. We are so grateful to both you and the rest of Harmony Interactive Learning for sharing your wisdom, your passion, and your expertise. And thank you again to all of our attendees today for your participation and partnership. And y'all, we hope that you'll join us again for a future product placement webinar where IACET positions our corporate affiliates and sponsors right alongside our accredited provider community, exploring how we can tackle tomorrow's challenges today. Thank you again, Rahul, and we hope that everyone has a fantastic rest of your week.
Thank you very much, Brad.